My cousins got $75,000 each from Grandpa, but when he got sick, I was the one he turned to with his final confession, and then, I'm Taylor, 28, and I guess you could say my family situation has always been a little uneven. My cousins, Aiden, 30, Lily, 27, and Grace, 25, have always had it all. Good looks, good grades, good jobs, and now, apparently, good fortune, thanks to Grandpa Joseph. Grandpa is 84, and while he's been up and down in health for a few years, we never expected him to just start doling out money like Santa. But he did, and it was for everyone but me. I should explain a bit about Grandpa Joseph. He's a pretty reserved guy, always was, but I was the only one who felt close to him. From a young age, I'd spend my summers at his little cottage by the lake, helping him fix things around the house or listening to his endless supply of stories. I always figured if anyone was going to get a little something from Grandpa, maybe it would be me. So you can imagine my surprise when I found out he'd given each of my cousins $75,000. Yeah, $75,000 each, completely out of the blue. Aiden used his to pay off the last of his student loans. Lily bought a car, and Grace, well, she's planning a wedding, so I'm sure it'll go to a stunningly overpriced venue. Me? I got nothing. No call, no check, not even a card. At first, I brushed it off as maybe Grandpa was getting old and just forgot. But the feeling of resentment crept in. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Why them? And why leave me out? Despite my hurt feelings, I went to see him anyway. If anything, I needed to know why he'd left me out, even if I didn't like the answer. When I got to Grandpa's house, I wasn't prepared for what I saw. He looked frail, sitting in his old leather armchair by the window, the sunlight casting a soft glow on his thinning white hair. He seemed lost in thought, a shadow of the man I remembered from all those summers. But when he looked up and saw me, his eyes lit up with a familiar warmth, and for a moment, I forgot all about the inheritance and just felt grateful to see him. Taylor, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, I'm glad you came. I've been waiting for you. The words hung in the air, and I could feel a strange weight behind them. Grandpa wasn't one for dramatics, so for him to say something like that meant something. I sat down, trying to make light of it. Waiting for me? What, are you keeping secrets now, Grandpa? He gave me a faint smile. Oh, I've kept more secrets than you could imagine. And some, well, it's time they came to light. I didn't know what to say. He just kept looking at me with a kind of urgency, a sadness that made my heart ache. I know you heard about the money I gave Aiden, Lily, and Grace, he finally said. The directness caught me off guard. Yeah, I did hear about that, I admitted, trying to keep my voice steady. It wasn't an easy decision, he murmured, looking down at his hands. There's more to it than you know, Taylor. More than I can explain in one sitting. But you'll understand soon. You're the only one I trust to understand. I wanted to scream. Asterisk understand? Understand what? Asterisk instead. I forced myself to stay calm. Why didn't you give me anything, Grandpa? Did I do something wrong? His hand, cool and frail, reached over and covered mine. Taylor, you have no idea how much you mean to me. But sometimes we have to make hard choices for reasons we can't explain. I promise I had my reasons, and they weren't because I love you any less. My head spun. Here he was, hinting at some family secret, promising me I'd understand, but giving me no actual answers. Still, there was something in his eyes that made me feel like he was telling the truth, even if I didn't understand it. We sat in silence for a while, with Grandpa just gazing out the window. Finally, he cleared his throat. Taylor, I have to ask you something important. As you know, my health's been fragile. If it's not too much, I'd like you to stay with me for a while, just in case. I don't want to be alone. I felt a strange pang of guilt. Despite the unanswered questions and resentment, I couldn't say no. Of course, Grandpa. I'll be here as long as you need. Over the next few days, I settled into a routine, helping Grandpa with his meals, managing his medication, and keeping him company. My cousins called a few times to check in, but none of them offered to visit or help out. It was like they'd taken the money and washed their hands of him. I tried not to let it get to me, but it was hard not to feel like the odd one out, the only one who cared. One night, after getting Grandpa settled in bed, I sat in the living room, thinking about our conversation. I'd always felt close to him, yet it seemed like he'd kept this enormous part of himself hidden. What could he possibly mean by hard choices and secrets? Was there really something so huge he'd kept it from me all these years? And then, just as I was about to drift off on the couch, Grandpa called my name. His voice was faint but urgent. I rushed to his side, worried something had happened, but he just looked at me with a strange intensity. "Taylor," he whispered, "there's something I need you to know, before it's too late." My heart pounded. This was it, the confession he'd hinted at. But just as he opened his mouth to speak, a fit of coughing took over, and he couldn't get the words out. I waited, feeling helpless as I watched him struggle to breathe. After what felt like an eternity, he calmed down, but he was too weak to talk. He just looked at me, eyes full of something I couldn't quite read, something between regret and relief. "Tomorrow," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "We'll talk tomorrow." The rest of the night, I could hardly sleep. I kept replaying his words, wondering what he'd been about to tell me. By morning, he was too exhausted to even get out of bed, let alone have a serious conversation. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something huge lurking just beneath the surface, something he needed me to know. As the days passed, Grandpa's condition worsened. He drifted in and out of consciousness, and with each passing hour, my anxiety grew. I stayed by his side, hoping he'd regain enough strength to finally tell me what he'd been holding back. Then, one night, when I was half asleep by his bedside, he grabbed my hand with surprising strength. "Taylor," he whispered, "go to the study. The key, it's under the loose floorboard. You'll find what you need there." Before I could ask what he meant, he fell back into sleep. But I knew I couldn't wait any longer. Whatever Grandpa had been holding on to, I needed to find it. And with a strange mix of excitement and dread, I decided I would look for it the next morning. The following days with Grandpa were intense. His health was slipping fast, and while I stayed close, keeping his water glass full and his medications on schedule, he began to grow restless. He'd mumble incoherently at times, phrases I couldn't piece together, but in his clearer moments, he'd fix me with this look, like he was struggling with something so heavy it was pressing the life out of him. One evening, after settling him in his bed, I noticed his breathing was more labored. He kept glancing toward the door, as if he were waiting for someone. After a few minutes of silence, he beckoned me closer. "Taylor," he croaked, voice weaker than I'd ever heard it. I've made mistakes, and I have to tell you about the money." The way he said it made my heart skip a beat. "What mistakes, Grandpa? What about the money?" I asked, leaning in, barely breathing so I wouldn't miss a word. "Your cousins, Aiden, Lily, Grace, they got that money, but it wasn't a gift, Taylor. It was repayment." "Repayment?" I repeated, confused. His eyes clouded over as he looked away, lost in thought. "Years ago, there was an incident, a betrayal," he whispered. "It's something I've kept buried for years, but I never stopped thinking about it." "What happened, Grandpa?" I whispered, my pulse pounding as I waited. He took a shaky breath. "When I was younger, I was part of something with my siblings. Your great-aunt Eleanor, your great-uncle Sam. We had plans. We all came together to protect what we thought was ours. But it got messy. There was money that wasn't ours to keep, decisions that weren't ours to make. And in the end, the family suffered." He paused, collecting his thoughts, looking like he was reliving every painful moment. "It's why your great-aunt and great-uncle left, why the family fell apart. I was the last one left, carrying the weight of it all, carrying the money that didn't belong to me. But I couldn't give it all back, not without tearing the family apart even more. So, I kept it hidden, and when Aiden, Lily, and Grace came of age, I tried to make amends, to give them back what they were owed. I felt a rush of disbelief, like I was hearing about someone else's life, someone else's family." "You mean, the money you gave them was from some scandal with our family's money?" Grandpa nodded, his face filled with guilt. "It wasn't just any money, Taylor. It was money that could have ruined us if anyone found out. Your cousins, they deserved it, but it wasn't a gift. It was to make up for the damage I caused. I tried to process it all, the idea that my cousin's inheritance wasn't some generous gift from a doting grandfather, but rather a quiet attempt at reparations for a scandal they'd never even known about. Why didn't you give me anything then? Why keep me out of it? A pained look crossed his face. You were different, Taylor. You were never a part of it, and I didn't want to burden you with the weight of what I'd done. But now, I see it wasn't fair. Not fair to you or to them. I sat there, trying to wrap my head around everything. The family I thought I knew, the cousins I thought I understood. All of it suddenly felt like a lie. I could feel the weight of the secret settling on me, a burden Grandpa had carried alone for years, and now he was sharing it with me. Taylor, he said, reaching for my hand. His grip was weak, but his eyes were intense. There's more. More than I can tell you now. But you need to know everything. My mind raced, filled with questions. Then tell me, Grandpa, what else do I need to know? He took a deep breath, struggling to gather his thoughts. In the study, he whispered, barely able to get the words out. Under the floorboard, where I told you to look, there's a letter, and it explains everything. He fumbled in his bedside drawer, his hands trembling, and finally produced a small key, pressing it into my hand. It felt cold and solid, and I knew this wasn't just any key. This will open the box. The one under the floorboard. It's all in there, Taylor. Everything you need to understand. The urgency in his voice sent chills down my spine. I'll read it, Grandpa. I'll find out everything. He gave a faint nod, sinking back against his pillow, exhaustion etched into every line of his face. For a moment, it looked like he was at peace, like he'd finally let go of something that had been gnawing at him for decades. But as I sat there, holding the key and wondering what I'd find in the study, he opened his eyes once more. Taylor, don't judge me too harshly, he whispered, his voice barely audible. I thought I was doing what was best. Before I could say anything, he drifted back into sleep, leaving me alone with the key and the weight of his confession. I sat there for a long time, staring at the small key in my hand, wondering what kind of secrets a piece of metal could unlock. My mind was racing, but I couldn't bring myself to go searching through the study that night. I needed to let his words sink in, to wrap my mind around the fact that everything I thought I knew about my family was now tainted by this secret. The next morning, I was up early, barely able to sleep from the anticipation and fear gnawing at me. I went down to the study, hands shaking as I knelt on the floor. I found the loose floorboard Grandpa had mentioned, prying it up with my fingertips until I saw the small, metal box nestled underneath. The box was heavier than I'd expected, and as I pulled it out, I felt a surge of dread, as if opening it would change everything forever. The key fit perfectly, clicking open with a soft sound that seemed louder than it should in the silence of the room. I lifted the lid, and there it was, a thick envelope with my name scrawled in Grandpa's familiar handwriting. Next to it was a stack of old, faded documents, their edges brittle and yellowed with age. I picked up the letter first, unfolding it carefully. It began with an apology, Grandpa's handwriting shaky but clear as he laid out the story in full. He described a long-forgotten feud over a piece of land that had belonged to the family generations ago. The land had been worth a fortune, and when his siblings insisted on selling it, Grandpa had resisted, desperate to keep the family legacy intact. But things had gotten ugly. His siblings had gone behind his back, selling the land and pocketing the money. Grandpa had retaliated by siphoning funds from the family accounts to even the score. It was a mess, a tangled web of resentment and betrayal that had left scars on the family for years. And in the end, he'd ended up with money that wasn't rightfully his. Money he'd used to pay off his own guilt by giving it to my cousins. I couldn't believe it. The idea that Grandpa had been carrying around this shame, this secret for so long. It was hard to imagine. And yet, I felt an odd sense of relief, as if understanding the truth somehow explained so much of the tension I'd always felt around our family. As I sat there, staring at the letter, I felt a strange sense of power. Here, in my hands, was the truth, a truth that could shatter the family's image of Grandpa and maybe even each other. And yet, I couldn't decide what to do with it. Should I confront my cousins? Should I let them know the truth about their so-called inheritance? Or should I keep Grandpa's secret and let him rest in peace? Before I could come to a decision, I heard Grandpa calling my name faintly from his room. Tucking the letter and documents back into the box, I hurried back to his bedside, the key clutched tightly in my hand. He looked at me, eyes heavy with emotion, but there was a faint smile on his lips. You found it, didn't you?" he murmured, as if he already knew. I nodded, feeling a surge of something indescribable. "Yes, Grandpa, I found it." He gave a weak nod, his gaze drifting off. "Good. That's good." And with that, he sank back into the pillows, his breathing slow and steady, finally at peace. I sat beside him until he drifted off, still grappling with the choice I'd have to make and the power his confession had given me. Grandpa Joseph passed away peacefully a few days after our last conversation. I'd been by his side, holding his hand as he took his final breaths, feeling a mix of sadness and relief, knowing he'd finally let go of the burdens he'd carried for so long. He'd left me with more questions than answers, though, and I couldn't shake the feeling that his death hadn't put an end to the story he'd started. After the funeral, family members drifted back to their routines, and life went on. My cousins barely mentioned Grandpa's passing beyond obligatory condolences. They'd gotten their inheritance checks and moved on. None of them asked about his remaining estate, assuming they'd already received what Grandpa had wanted them to have. So when Grandpa's attorney called me in to go over his will, I was the only one to show up. I half expected to hear that Grandpa hadn't left much else, that his estate was as modest as his lifestyle had always seemed. But as I walked into his now empty home, armed with the key he'd given me, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more hidden here than anyone had suspected. The attorney, a quiet man named Mr. Carlyle, greeted me with a small nod and gestured for me to sit at the dining table. He placed a small stack of papers in front of me, his expression grave. "Taylor," he began, "your grandfather's will is unusual. I wasn't able to file it officially, as it appears he wanted you to decide what to do with the contents of his estate." I blinked, trying to process what he meant. Decide? Isn't the will supposed to make those decisions? Mr. Carlyle adjusted his glasses. Under normal circumstances, yes. But it seems your grandfather's wishes depended on the context. He left specific instructions that I was only to release the details of his estate to you. He slid a thin folder across the table. Inside was a handwritten letter addressed to me, along with an unfiled and signed copy of his will. I opened the letter first, recognizing Grandpa's familiar handwriting and feeling a pang of emotion as I read his words. "Dear Taylor, asterisk if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and you've discovered the truth I hid for so long. I hope, now, you understand why I made the choices I did. I didn't mean to hurt you or make you feel left out. I just wanted to right a wrong I committed a long time ago, even if I never had the courage to admit it aloud, asterisk. Asterisk my siblings, Eleanor and Sam, betrayed me years ago, stealing from the family to fund their own ventures and leaving me to pick up the pieces. In my anger, I made my own mistakes, keeping funds I shouldn't have, convincing myself it was my due for what they'd taken. But it was pride, plain and simple, that kept me silent for all these years. I took that money, and when the time came, I tried to repay some of it through your cousin's inheritance, asterisk. Asterisk what I left behind for you is what remains of my estate, and I entrust it to you entirely. You're the only one I feel could truly understand what this legacy means, beyond just money. I know this is a lot to ask, but whether you share this with the rest of the family or keep it private, I trust your judgment, asterisk. Thank you, Taylor, for being the one person who saw me for who I really was, not just as an old man with regrets, but as someone who tried to do the right thing, even if I didn't always succeed. Asterisk all my love. Joseph, asterisk. I sat there, my heart heavy with the weight of his words. Grandpa had spent his life quietly trying to make amends, to repay a debt no one else even knew about. And now, he'd left me not only with the inheritance, but with the responsibility of deciding what to do with it. Setting the letter aside, I turned to the will. It was simple, short, and incredibly clear. Everything else, his house, his savings, even a few rare family heirlooms, was left to me. The estate wasn't worth a fortune, but it was significant, more than I'd expected. The thought of inheriting it all filled me with a strange mix of guilt and gratitude. Grandpa had left me his legacy, yes, but also the truth and the burden of deciding what to do with it. When I told my cousins that I was handling Grandpa's estate, they barely reacted. Aiden shrugged, saying he'd assumed Grandpa didn't have much left. Lily laughed, saying she'd already spent most of her inheritance. Grace simply said she didn't have time to deal with old man business. None of them showed any interest in the property or the final details. They seemed content, each assuming they'd already received their share. It was like they had no idea the depth of what Grandpa had left behind, or the weight of the choices he'd given me. Alone in Grandpa's house, I began piecing through his things, slowly uncovering the layers of his life. As I went through drawers, photo albums, and boxes of old documents, I found small reminders of the family he'd tried to hold together. It was a bittersweet experience, seeing the remnants of the life he'd kept hidden from everyone but me. In the back of his study, I eventually found an old safe tucked away behind a bookshelf. I remembered Grandpa's words about the key to everything and pulled out the small metal key he'd given me before he passed. With a deep breath, I inserted it into the lock and turned, the safe door swinging open with a quiet creak. Inside, I found a sealed envelope labeled to be opened only by Taylor. I sat back, clutching the envelope, the weight of it heavy in my hands. Inside, I discovered another letter, one that delved even deeper into the story of the family betrayal. Grandpa's siblings had sold off family property in secret, pocketing most of the money and leaving him with little. When he'd confronted them, they'd cut ties completely, leaving him alone to manage what was left of the estate. He'd been left to rebuild the family's wealth on his own, hiding what little he'd managed to salvage. But over the years, as guilt gnawed at him, he'd started putting together the funds to return some of it to his nieces and nephews, even though they had no knowledge of the scandal. To Grandpa, it was a way of balancing the scales, even if it meant living with secrets until his last breath. As I read the final words of the letter, I realized Grandpa had left me more than just an inheritance. He'd given me the choice of whether or not to reveal the truth to my cousins, to lift the veil on the idealized version of our family that we'd all clung to. I could keep the house, the remaining money, the artifacts of his life, or I could try to repay the debt in my own way, using the estate to mend the fractures Grandpa had tried so hard to heal. The decision weighed on me, the lines blurring between loyalty to Grandpa's wishes and the justice he'd never been able to achieve. If I told Aiden, Lily, and Grace the truth, it could change everything, not just for them but for the memory of Grandpa, the man they thought they knew. But if I kept the secret, I'd be carrying the burden alone, the way Grandpa had all these years. Sitting in the silence of his house, I thought of the summers I'd spent here, of the stories Grandpa had shared, and of the secrets he'd kept locked away. The power he'd given me felt heavy, like a weight pressing on my chest, but I knew I had to make a choice. As I left the study, the letter still clutched in my hand. I knew one thing for sure. Whatever decision I made, it would change my family forever. I spent days wrestling with what to do. Grandpa's final confession weighed heavily on me, making sleep elusive and filling my mind with endless questions. My cousins, Aiden, Lily, and Grace, were blissfully unaware of everything, going on with their lives as if Grandpa's passing hadn't left any lingering mysteries. Part of me envied them for that, for not having to grapple with secrets, debts, or family betrayals. But their indifference also made me feel alone, like I was the only one who truly cared about what Grandpa had tried to fix, even if he hadn't done it perfectly. It wasn't long before a family gathering forced us all to be in the same room again. It was a casual brunch, something Aunt Debbie had put together in Grandpa's memory. As I arrived, I noticed Aiden and Lily laughing about something, looking carefree. Grace was with her fiancé, talking excitedly about their upcoming wedding. I felt out of place, burdened with knowledge they didn't have, knowledge that would alter everything if I let it. At one point, as we were all gathered around, someone brought up Grandpa's inheritance. Lily rolled her eyes, saying, it was nice of Grandpa, but let's be honest. It wasn't exactly a life-changing amount. Aiden chuckled, nodding. Yeah, I blew through it on my loans. But hey, free money's free money, right? I couldn't hold back anymore. The dismissive tone, the way they treated Grandpa's gift as some casual handout, made my blood boil. Do you all realize what that small token actually meant? I blurted, feeling my heartbeat hammering in my chest. They looked at me, surprised. Grace's eyes widened slightly, but Aiden just smirked. Yeah, it meant he liked us enough to give us something, he said, as if he were stating the obvious. No, I said, shaking my head, feeling the weight of Grandpa's secrets pressing down. It wasn't a gift, not in the way you think. It was repayment. Grandpa felt he owed it to you, to make up for something that happened a long time ago. They stared at me, confusion flickering across their faces. Lily crossed her arms. What are you talking about, Taylor? Repayment for what? I took a deep breath, feeling the enormity of what I was about to say. Grandpa was carrying a burden he'd hidden from everyone. Our family went through a huge betrayal decades ago. His siblings? They swindled him out of family assets, and in his own way, Grandpa tried to even the score by keeping some of the funds for himself. When he gave you all that money, it wasn't some random act of generosity. It was his way of repaying a debt he believed he owed. For a moment, they were all silent. The room felt tense, the air thick with disbelief. Aiden was the first to break the silence, his voice laced with irritation. So, you're saying Grandpa was some kind of thief? That doesn't sound like him at all. It wasn't theft, I argued, trying to explain what Grandpa had told me. It was complicated. He felt betrayed by his siblings and took what he thought was rightfully his, but he regretted it. And he spent his entire life trying to make amends. Grace's face had gone pale, her hand covering her mouth. Oh my God, I had no idea. He never said a word about any of this. Well, of course he didn't, Aiden scoffed, his tone skeptical. Why would he keep it quiet all these years just to have it come out now? Are you sure you're not just, I don't know, misinterpreting things? I'm not misinterpreting anything, I snapped, feeling defensive. He left me with a letter. It explained everything, why he did what he did, and why he gave you the inheritance. He wanted to make things right, even if it wasn't a perfect solution. Lily shook her head, her eyes flashing with anger. So you knew all this, and you decided to just tell us now? When he's not even here to defend himself? Her words stung, but I held my ground. I thought you had the right to know the truth. Don't you get it? This wasn't just some random act of generosity. Grandpa was trying to fix something that had haunted him for decades. Haunted? Aiden echoed, laughing bitterly. So, what? You're saying he gave us tainted money? I felt myself growing frustrated, hurt that they didn't seem to grasp the depth of what Grandpa had done. He did what he thought was best. He was carrying all this guilt alone, and this was his way of making things right. You weren't just gifted that money. You were being repaid for a debt none of you even knew existed. Grace's eyes were teary, her voice barely a whisper. I don't understand. Why didn't he just tell us himself? Because he was ashamed, I replied softly. He didn't want you to see him as someone who had made mistakes. He wanted to make things right quietly, to protect our family's reputation. Aiden shook his head, still unconvinced. And what about you, Taylor? Why did he tell you? Why did he leave you everything else? I don't know, I admitted, feeling the weight of their gazes on me. Maybe he trusted me to handle it. Or maybe he thought I'd understand. But he left me with this choice, and I'm telling you because I thought you deserved to know. Lily stood up, crossing her arms tightly. So, what now? Are you expecting us to feel grateful? Guilty? I don't know what you want from us, Taylor. I'm not asking for anything, I replied, struggling to keep my voice steady. I just wanted you to know the truth. What you do with it is up to you. Aiden looked at me with a cold expression. So, you're saying Grandpa left you in charge of everything else? All his things, the house, whatever money's left. You're the keeper of his legacy now, is that it? I could hear the bitterness in his voice, and it hurt. I didn't ask for this, Aiden. I didn't want to be the one carrying all of this. But Grandpa trusted me, and I'm trying to honor that. Grace looked at me, her expression a mix of confusion and sadness. This changes everything. All these years, we thought we knew him. There was silence, a thick tension settling over us. Each of my cousins seemed lost in their own thoughts, processing the revelation in different ways. Aiden looked resentful, like he'd been cheated out of some idealized image of Grandpa. Lily was angry, her arms crossed defensively. And Grace, for once, was quiet, lost in her own thoughts. Finally, Lily broke the silence. "So, what are you going to do, Taylor? Are you going to keep everything, or are you planning to share this big, burden legacy of his?" Her words stung, but I could see the pain behind her anger. "I haven't decided yet," I admitted. "But whatever I choose, it won't change what Grandpa did, or what he tried to make up for. That's his legacy, whether we like it or not." Aiden scoffed. "Well, I hope you find some comfort in that. Because right now, it just feels like a betrayal. Like he kept us in the dark our whole lives, and now we're just supposed to accept it." "I'm not asking you to accept anything," I said quietly. "I'm just telling you the truth. What you do with it is up to you." One by one, they left, each of them visibly shaken and angry. Grace gave me a sad look, something close to understanding in her eyes, before she followed the others out. And just like that, I was left alone in Grandpa's house, the secrets and the inheritance still mine to bear, but now tinged with the resentment of my own family. As the door closed behind them, I felt a strange sense of relief mixed with guilt. I'd told them the truth, the heavy, complicated truth Grandpa had left for me. But I also knew that in doing so, I'd changed our family forever. The resentment, the betrayal, the weight of his decisions, these weren't burdens easily forgotten. And now, I had a choice of my own to make: to honor Grandpa's wishes and keep his estate, or to try and repair the damage by sharing his legacy, however imperfect it might be. The path forward was unclear, but one thing was certain: Grandpa's secrets had finally unraveled, and there was no going back. If you like this story, subscribe right away and listen to new stories every day. Let us know what you like the most in the comments.